I liked it all right, but I had to get out and earn a little bread. I had to get out and earn a living. Oh, what do I remember most about my childhood? Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches.
In the golden age of Hollywood, few men carried presence quite like Steve McQueen. With his quiet intensity, effortless cool, and unforgettable roles in films like Bullitt and The Great Escape, he became a symbol of strength that felt almost untouchable. But behind that silence was a man who never quite found peace. He loved deeply, he married more than once, and he left behind a trail of relationships that never fully lasted. Yet, in the final chapter of his life, when the noise of fame had faded, one truth became quietly clear. Among all the women he loved, there was one he never truly forgot. So let me ask you, who do you believe was the true love of Steve McQueen's life? Tell me in the comments. The first love before fame, Gia Scala. Before the fame, before the speed, before the image the world would come to admire, Steve McQueen was still trying to understand what love meant and how to hold on to it. It was during his early years in New York, studying acting and struggling to find direction, that he met Gia Scala. She was young, talented, and already beginning to make a name for herself. There was a quiet elegance about her, something steady and composed that stood in contrast to McQueen's restless energy. Where he was searching, she seemed certain. Their connection formed naturally. Long conversations, shared ambitions, and the quiet understanding that comes when two people are both standing at the edge of something unknown. For McQueen, it was one of the first times he experienced a relationship that felt real, not built on fame or expectation, but on presence. But even in those early days, something within him remained unsettled. McQueen wasn't just chasing success, he was chasing identity. And that kind of pursuit rarely leaves room for stability. As opportunities slowly began to appear, his focus shifted. The relationship that once felt grounding began to feel like something he might outgrow. Gia, on the other hand, was ready for something more certain. And so, without a dramatic ending or public fallout, the relationship quietly faded. No headlines, no scandal, just distance. Looking back, it's easy to see what that relationship represented. Not a great love, but a glimpse of what love could have been, if timing had been different. If he had been different. Because sometimes the earliest connections in our lives don't fail because they lack meaning. They fail because we haven't yet become the person capable of keeping them. And some beginnings are not meant to last, only to prepare us for what comes next. The marriage that tried to save him, Neile Adams. By the time Steve McQueen met Neile Adams, his life was beginning to take shape, but not yet in the way the world would later see it. She entered his life at a moment when he needed more than ambition. He needed stability. Neile Adams was not drawn to the image he would become. She saw the man beneath it, disciplined, determined, but still carrying the quiet scars of a difficult past. Where others might have been intimidated by his intensity, she met it with patience. They married in 1956, and for a time their life together felt grounded. They built a home. They raised 2 children. And as McQueen's career slowly began to rise, Neile remained a constant presence, supportive, steady, and deeply invested in the life they were creating together. In many ways, she gave him something he had never truly experienced before, a sense of belonging. But as success arrived, so did everything that came with it. Long hours on set, increasing attention, and the subtle shift that fame brings into a person's life. McQueen began to change. The restlessness that had always lived beneath the surface returned, stronger now. He sought freedom, space, and eventually escape in ways that began to distance him from the very life Neile had helped build. Affairs became part of that distance. What had once been a partnership slowly turned into something strained, held together more by history than by connection. Neile stayed longer than most would have. She believed in the man she had married. even as he became harder to recognize. But belief alone cannot hold a marriage together. After 16 years, it came to an end. For McQueen, it was more than the loss of a wife. It was the loss of the one person who had tried to give him a stable life, before everything else pulled him away. Sometimes, the love that saves us is the one we don't realize we needed until it's gone. The woman who came between, Barbara Leigh. By the early 1970s, Steve McQueen's life had already begun to shift. His marriage to Neile Adams was no longer what it once had been. The connection that had once grounded him was now strained, distant, and quietly unraveling. And in that space, between what was ending and what had not yet begun, someone else entered his life. Barbara Leigh. She was young, striking, and drawn into McQueen's world at a time when he was already searching for something new. Their relationship did not begin with promises or long-term intentions. It began with immediacy, companionship in a moment where everything else felt uncertain. For McQueen, it was an escape. For Barbara, it felt like something more. As their connection deepened, the reality surrounding it became more complicated. McQueen was still legally married. His life was still tied to the family he had built. And yet emotionally, he was already somewhere else. Then came a moment that would change everything. Barbara became pregnant. It was not something either of them had planned, and the weight of that reality forced decisions neither of them were truly prepared to make. In the end, the pregnancy was not carried forward, a choice that would quietly mark the relationship in a way words rarely capture. What they had did not collapse in a dramatic way. It simply could not continue, because some relationships exist only in transition, formed in the space between endings and beginnings, but never meant to become either. For McQueen, Barbara Leigh was not the love of his life, but she was part of a chapter that revealed something deeper. That even in moments of closeness, he was still searching. And sometimes, the people who enter our lives in uncertain moments leave with answers we're not ready to face. The many affairs that changed him: fame, temptation, and distance. As Steve McQueen's fame reached its peak, something else began to grow alongside it: distance, not just from others, but from himself. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, McQueen had become one of the most recognized faces in Hollywood. Success followed him everywhere. So did attention. And with that attention came temptation, constant, effortless, and difficult to resist. There were relationships that lasted only briefly, and others that lingered just long enough to leave an impression. Names like Lauren Hutton, Mamie Van Doren, and others quietly became part of his story. Some were confirmed, others remained rumors carried through Hollywood circles. But the pattern was clear. These weren't relationships built on depth or time. They were moments, intense, fleeting, and often overlapping with the life he had already built elsewhere. For McQueen, they offered something immediate: distraction, freedom, control. Yet beneath that surface, something else was happening. The more he moved from one connection to another, the less any of them seemed to hold meaning. What once may have felt exciting slowly became routine. And what was routine began to feel empty. Fame had given him access to everything he thought he wanted, but it hadn't given him clarity. Instead, it blurred the line between connection and escape, between love and attention, between presence and absence. And over time, that blur began to follow him into every part of his life. Because when every door is open, it becomes harder to recognize which one actually leads somewhere. For McQueen, this period was not defined by one woman. It was defined by many, and yet, somehow, by none. Sometimes, having everything within reach only reminds you that what you're truly looking for is still missing. The calm before the end. Barbara Minty. By the late 1970s, Steve McQueen was no longer chasing the same things. The speed, the constant movement, the restless pursuit that had once defined him had begun to slow. Not completely, but enough for something quieter to enter his life. That was when he met Barbara Minty. She was different from the women who had come before. There was no chaos surrounding her, no intensity that demanded attention. Instead, she brought a kind of calm that McQueen had rarely experienced. Their relationship developed away from the spotlight. No headlines, no sudden drama, just presence. By this point, McQueen himself was changing. Years of success, broken relationships, and personal reflection had begun to shift his perspective. He was no longer trying to prove himself in the same way. What he wanted now was simpler: peace. In 1980, they married. It was his third marriage, and in many ways, his quietest. Those close to him noticed the difference. He seemed more grounded, more reflective, less driven by the impulses that had once defined his choices. There was even a spiritual shift taking place in his life. A search for meaning beyond fame, beyond success, beyond the identity he had carried for so long. Barbara Minty became part of that final chapter. She was there not during the rise, but near the end. Not during the chaos, but during the slowing. And yet, for all the calm she brought into his life, there was something that remained unspoken. Because peace and love are not always the same thing. Sometimes one arrives after the other has already passed. And sometimes the quietest chapter of our lives is not where love begins, but where we finally understand it. The love that changed everything. Ali MacGraw. Before the calm, before the reflection, there was a love that changed everything. Her name was Ali MacGraw. When Steve McQueen met her during the filming of The Getaway in 1972, something immediate happened. Something that didn't build slowly or cautiously. It arrived with intensity, as if both of them recognized it at the same time. Ali was not like the others. She didn't adjust herself to fit his world. She didn't stand in the background of his life. Instead, she met him directly, with her own strength, her own independence, and a presence that refused to be controlled. For McQueen, that was rare and irresistible. Their connection quickly moved beyond the film set. Conversations became personal. Personal became emotional. And emotional became something neither of them could ignore. But there was a cost. They were both married. What followed was not quiet. It was public, complicated, and impossible to contain. Ali left her husband. McQueen's marriage came to an end. And in 1973, they married, stepping into a relationship that had already begun in intensity. For a time, it felt like everything he had been searching for. But love, for McQueen, was never separate from fear. The deeper he felt, the more he tried to hold on. And the more he tried to hold on, the more control began to replace trust. Jealousy surfaced, tension grew. What had once felt natural became strained. Ali, who had once matched him, began to feel confined by the very love that had brought them together. And slowly, the relationship that had started so powerfully began to break. Because some loves don't fade. They burn. And when they burn too brightly, they don't disappear. They leave a mark that never fully goes away. And sometimes, the love that changes us the most is the one we can't make stay. The one he never truly let go, his final truth. By the time Steve McQueen reached the final chapter of his life, everything around him had grown quieter. The noise of Hollywood had faded. The constant movement had slowed. And the man once known for control was beginning to reflect. Illness has a way of doing that. It strips away distraction. It removes the need to impress. And in that silence, what remains is not success, but truth. McQueen had known many relationships. He had experienced marriage, passion, conflict, and distance. He had been loved, and he had walked away from love more than once. But near the end, those close to him noticed something subtle. When he spoke about the past, one name carried a different weight: Ali MacGraw. not with regret alone, but with recognition. What they had shared had not been simple. It had been intense, complicated, and at times destructive. But it had also been real in a way few other relationships in his life ever reached. It wasn't the calmest love, it wasn't the easiest love, but it was the one that stayed with him, even after the separation, even after the years had passed, even when his life had moved forward in every visible way. Because some connections don't end when the relationship does. They remain quietly, beneath everything else. And in those final reflections, it became clear, not through grand statements, but through the weight of what was remembered, that among all the women who had entered his life, she was the one he never truly replaced. And sometimes, the love of our life is not the one we keep, but the one we carry with us to the very end. The life of Steve McQueen reminds us that even the strongest men carry complicated stories behind their silence. Fame, success, and admiration may shape the outside world, but love shapes what remains when everything else fades. Through relationships that began with hope, burned with intensity, and ended in quiet reflection, one truth slowly revealed itself. The greatest love is not always the one that lasts the longest, but the one that changes us the deepest. And perhaps that is the question his story leaves behind. Have you ever had a love like that? If you enjoy stories from classic Hollywood and the hidden truths behind legendary lives, consider subscribing. More timeless stories are waiting to be told.